Welcome to a live special episode of Capital Gains, Yahoo Finance's unique look at how U.S. government policy could impact your bottom line. I'm your host, Madison Mills. We are in the studio today breaking down everything you need to know in Washington following President Trump's inauguration.
The golden age of America begins right now. I will declare a national emergency at our southern border to defeat what was record inflation and rapidly bring down costs and prices. We will end the Green New Deal and we will revoke the electric vehicle mandate. We are establishing the External Revenue Service to collect all tariffs, duties, and revenues. We'll establish the brand new Department of Government Efficiency. America will be respected again and admired again.
A busy day one for President Trump, signing more than 24 executive orders on everything from energy to immigration policy, with more orders still expected. We'll walk you through everything to know about Trump's day one and how it could impact the path forward for his economic agenda. But before we get into that, let me introduce my co-stars, Rochelle Akuvo and Ben Werschgirl. Rochelle and Ben, welcome.
Hey there.
Hi, Maddie.
Great to chat with you guys. I want to start with you, Ben. We're in 24 hours now into this new Trump administration. What's top of mind for you?
Yeah, for sure. We are exactly, as we're speaking now, we are exactly 24 hours because he took the oath of office at about 12:01, 24 hours ago. And I have four things kind of we've learned about Trump these first 24 hours to kick us off. The first is, as you heard in that clip, a sort of a keen focus on two issues. This is something they've been telegraphing, but they went forward it. One is immigration. The second is energy. That was a big focus of Trump's early executives orders, and energy with the one, obviously a keen of interest to investors, pushing really hard on opening up new areas for drilling, cutting regulations that Trump is going to keep on. He's going to keep on with more executive orders, and Congress is also going to address energy issues. The big question around that is whether oil companies need this. The oil prices are already kind of on the lower side, and they're projected to go even lower. So there's a question of whether oil companies will want to take advantage of all these new opportunities they're being given. The third one is tariffs. Trump he avoided big day one action on tariffs. His one executive order there was essentially to launch a review of trade practices. And that was the sense there from folks I talked to, was that this was a way to not upset markets on day one. But Trump being Trump, he couldn't kind of let the day end without making news on it. And he talked about how he wants to do 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico on February 1st, which is just about 10 days away. So that's coming, and it's clearly top of mind for him. The fourth one, just to start us off, is TikTok. He unveiled a ban there to try to delay the app for 75 days. But what the overall message you got from Trump over this whole weekend was how close he is to TikTok. He's talked about a warm spot he has for TikTok. He talks about how young people liked him on that app, so he's a fan of it. So that's a big one with the TikTok CEO there at the inauguration as well. The overall sort of theme here, I think, to kind of tie these together and to pitch it forward, are lawsuits. All of these are kind of attempts to push forward presidential power, and all of them are going to face, in different ways, legal challenges. TikTok is a big one, but a variety of these issues are really legally questionable. So the question is kind of what does it look like going forward for Trump as he tries to move forward on these?
Ben, it's interesting that you mentioned Shochu. He was actually seated next to Tulsi Gabbard, who's Trump's national intelligence director pick. So interesting seating. And that really ties into this whole brocracy. We saw front row, all the tech bros, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. We saw Tim Cook seated, was also seated there as well. But we also saw Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai. So imagine if you're the tech bros and you're front and center, you're in front of Trump's cabinet nominees. They were sitting behind them. And you even had some Republican governors, including Florida's Ron DeSantis, Georgia's Brian Kemp, some of these key swing state governors in the overflow room, not even in the back seat, but really in the overflow room. And we know that there does tend to be a lot of optics and showmanship. Everything is a little bit strategic in terms of how everyone is sort of seated and placed. So people are wondering, is this a sign that it really is going to be the sort of oligarch brotocracy that's really going to be informing the Trump agenda, which really isn't in line with this sort of K-shaped economy where people are saying, look, the people who voted for him, they're worried about inflation. They're worried about, the price of eggs. So it was interesting to see how that matches up in terms of the seating chart there. And look, people are saying this is what we ran on, right? This is what we voted for. We voted for the Trump agenda. I'm not sure that the tech brotocracy is what they had in mind when they were trying to, get their grocery list together.
Yeah, I think it's such a great point, Rochelle, especially in the context of Trump 1.0. We saw how long individuals close to Trump lasted. And Bradley Tusk, a venture capitalist, joined me this morning for a conversation on this. And he said, ultimately, what Trump wants for his agenda is what wins. So don't read too much as an investor into something like Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg being in the room. If Trump wants a certain policy, like, for example, the pausing of the TikTok ban, to endure, he is going to go with what he wants, not necessarily with what the tech CEOs in the room might want from him. Having said that, I also want to talk a little bit with both of you about his immigration policy. This was something he clearly was very focused on day one, issuing a slew of executive orders on immigration. And he specifically talked about a few different things, obviously declaring a crisis at the border, but also revoking birthright citizenship, which we know is protected under the Constitution. So that's been something that leads to this question about the longevity of these executive orders. But this morning, we've been talking a lot about this specific comment he made on legal immigration. Take a listen.
I'm fine with legal immigration. I like it. We need people, and I'm absolutely fine with it. We want to have it. We need it because we're going to have a lot of companies coming in to avoid tariffs. We have to have legal immigration.
So I spoke with an immigration expert about that line this morning, and I asked her, do you buy this idea from President Trump that legal immigration could be used as a backfill for any job loss that is created due to new policies on immigration? And she said, look at the Trump 1.0 agenda to get clarity on that. He said very similar things back in 2016, and then we did not see a huge move to the upside on legal immigration. And that really clarified things from my perspective about how we should be looking not only at his immigration policy, but also just more broadly at the commentary coming from this administration, and the market reaction to that perhaps should be considered a little bit more widely moving forward here, as opposed to just kind of moving based on every single individual thing that Trump says. But I'm curious what you guys think about that. Ben, what do you think, given your reporting in DC?
I mean, I think the question that raises for me is does this brotocracy let him downplay that issue at all? I mean, I can tell you maybe Trump sort of doesn't have super strong feelings on H-1B visas, but I can tell you Elon Musk does, Mark Zuckerberg does. So that's a key difference, between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, is that these guys have incredible power there, and they have shown the ability to kind of get heard by him and get him do it. I think, there's going to be a split screen. We've already seen it during the transition, and I think it's going to continue, where harsh action on illegal immigration. One of the big things that Trump announced yesterday was troops at the southern border, which is, I think, what we're going to see soon, along with this kind of trying to toe the line on H-1B visas that Musk is not going to let him kind of fade away for certain.
And it's interesting because I did run some of the numbers in terms of the number of mentions through Grok, that's X's AI, tried to keep it as neutral as possible. And in terms of the mentions within the signed executive actions on day one that Trump had, topping the list in terms of ranking based on the emphasis and frequency of mentions when it comes to topics, immigration and border security far and above had the most mentions, including that national emergency declaration at the southern border, an attempt to end birthright citizenship, etc. Second was environmental and energy policy. We heard drill, baby, drill. We heard, we actually saw in a lot of the executive action that was revoked from the prior administration, a lot of the ones tied to climate risk, not just the Paris Accord, but also financial risk tied to climate. You also had government operations and federal employment. Obviously, the hiring freeze, having the federal workers return to work. But I wonder, when you look at those top three things, what you don't hear is the economy. That actually got much fewer mentions than those other three. It was very light on details. It was about sort of marshalling the cabinet to figure out how to do it, to figure out how to help with the cost of living crisis, which is what people said that they voted for him for. But we didn't see that. But we did see a lot when it came to immigration and border security, both during his inauguration speech and a lot of the cheers that he got as well, and a lot of the cultural and social issues. But it's hard to determine which of those are actually going to help bring any prices down, manage inflation, or give people the economy that they think they're now about to get. Keeping in mind, The economy is not in bad shape. I mean, the economists that we've been talking to, that they say the US economy has seen stronger recent growth in real GDP, productivity, real wages. You've got a low unemployment rate, inflation moderating, although ticking back up a little bit in January, moving towards the Fed's 2% target. But that does speak to that K-shaped economy. If you don't feel like you're doing well and only sort of the top 1% are doing well, overall, the numbers look like the economy's doing well, but if you don't feel like it's doing well when you're trying to pay your bills, get your food, put gas in your car, that's really what the voting comes down to.
And it's been fascinating to see consumer sentiment data that I know you all have talked about on the show so much, where Democrats and Republicans have completely flipped in terms of inflation expectations. Prior to the election, Republicans thinking inflation was going to be higher for longer. And after the election, that's flipped, and Democrats now leading to that inflation outlook. I do quickly want to mention energy. Trump declaring a national energy emergency yesterday and issuing some executive orders to that end. But it's interesting in the context of U.S. oil production. We heard Trump saying drill, baby, drill in the U.S., and he is efforting that in attempts to get oil costs down, which would, in his view, prevent some of the inflationary pressure that we have been seeing. But you can see on this chart here, the U.S. is already at peak oil production and has consistently over the past decade or so been trending in that direction as the top oil producer globally. So what will increased oil production actually do to the price of oil and the oil market more broadly is something that we will, of course, continue to monitor here at Yahoo Finance. We do have to take a quick break, but we're going to be right back with Henrietta Treyz and more capital gains after this. Welcome back to Capital Gains. We are now joined by Veda Partners Director of Economic Policy, Henrietta Treyz, as we track President Trump's initial agenda at the White House. Henrietta, the market is keenly focused on tariff policy, and we're seeing a bit of a relief rally in the market given the lack of any sweeping tariff policy, at least on day one. What are you telling clients about what's coming next on tariffs?
There's actually a series of events that we're about to see on the tariff front. In the first place, the idea of universal tariffs that you might have expected on day one is not consistent with Trump's first term. It's not consistent with the sort of novel approach that we saw from USTR Lighthizer in his first term. And of course, the incoming USTR is Jamison Greer, who was Lighthizer's chief of staff. So we're seeing a really continuation of the first Trump term, which is a nuanced approach using almost exhaustive trade remedy authorities across Section 232 national security tariffs, which we're expecting in the months ahead, starting with the EU as early as April 1st, given their March 31st expiration. A balance of payments authority, which allows the president to put 15% tariffs on any nation in which we have a balance of payments deficit for up to 150 days. An additional review of the Section 301 tariffs against China, including pulling out of the Phase 1 trade deal, which would escalate tariffs across what is currently about $350 billion worth of goods and could expand. And then, of course, IEEPA tariffs with Canada and Mexico that he sort of off the cuff threatened to impose on February 1st, and historically usually has a lag time of 10 days before implementation. So I think a lot is coming, and this is all a very exhaustive, very by the books way to implement trade strategy.
Hey, Henrietta, thanks for joining us. Curious one aspect of what you just mentioned there, which is something we've been talking about on this podcast for a while, which is why is Trump so obsessed with Canada? That's something we didn't hear during the campaign, and then sort of immediately afterwards, these Canada-Mexico tariffs. We saw it last night in these off-the-cuff comments you referenced. What are you telling clients on that? Why is Canada and Mexico as well in such a focus for Trump?
So I think in the first place, the Canada and Mexico approach is really about the USMCA renewal that's due in about 18 months, midway through next year. We're effectively setting the stage now. Some of the issues we have with Canada involve, of course, immigration and fentanyl, which is what the IEEPA tariffs are about. But the USMCA renewal, and let's remember that USMCA was the hallmark of his trade agenda outside of the U.S.-China trade war in his first term. That is going to revolve around issues around lumber and dairy. And he has similar issues with Mexico where it comes to investment in from China into the nation. So I think a lot of this is actually gearing up to prepare for pretty robust renewal negotiations on the USMCA.
And Henrietta, good to see you. Rochelle here. I want to ask you about the first 100 days. When you're looking at the different options in terms of tariffs, whether it's the USMCA, whether it's the US and China and the phase one trade deal, obviously that it's still kind of stalled, the EU, what do you think is going to be the most significant of those within the first 100 days?
First 100 days is a good starting place. I mean, I think we have to probably expect something on Canada and Mexico, at least in terms of massive headline risk around an IEEPA threat. And this 25% rate, I think, is really high historically. You know, back in May of 2019, the rate that he would have started the Mexico tariffs at was 5% and eventually land at 25% a couple months later in October of that year. So I think 25% is high. I'd watch for that number to come down. But obviously, February 1st is something that he's looking at announcing something on IEEPA with Canada and Mexico. So that would be the first thing. We also need to be mindful that his USTR, Jamieson Greer, and Commerce Secretary are going to have to go through their nomination hearings. And those are going to be flashpoints where the U.S. senators, particularly from the Republican Party in these farming states, try to hold those members' feet to the fire and say, hey, you know, be mindful that when you impose the tariffs, the retaliation is going to hit our constituents, mostly farm states in red states, from North Dakota to, you know, Alabama. So a lot of those issues are going to be front and center when we go through this nomination hearings in the next couple weeks. I think March 31st is critical to recall that the U.S. and EU have real tensions, and the EU is not negotiating with the United States, and it didn't under Biden either, to alleviate issues from steel and aluminum, which is what the tariffs are theoretically for, but really also their agriculture purchases and most pressingly their auto industry. And the fact that these high quality, sort of like high skilled labor components are made over in Germany and not in the United States. You hear President Trump himself talk about that with incredible depth for a trade issue, to talk about how upset they are at the fact that we're effectively, you know, a building shop where we put the hood on the car and the doors on, but they make the batteries and transmissions and all those high tech, sort of high skilled labor jobs they want here. And then finally, the China front, indications that we're going to start negotiations that have a 10, 20, 45 day allotment under the enforcement mechanism of phase one. So really everything is on the table, and I expect to hear all those pieces in the next 100 days.
And just quickly, do you think markets are pricing that in, or when will they start pricing that in?
I think markets are acting irrationally by being so excited that tariffs were not announced on day one. I think that that's something that we should have forecast, should have understood. You know, universal tariffs are not a good way to implement trade policy, which is why they didn't do it in the first term. And, you know, Lighthizer and Jamieson Greer are very close, and it's appropriate to expect a continuation. So just because tariffs didn't happen on day one should not make anybody comfortable. The America First trade policy agenda that had various dates, key agency officials targeted, you know, addendum after addendum, suggests that all this trade stuff is coming. The formation of the External Revenue Service alone should be cause for concern. I mean, my focus is on taxes and deficits at my core, and we need this revenue in order to offset the cost of the tax bill, or at least give the impression of paying down some of the cost of the deficits that will have to be incurred by writing a tax bill in 2025. We got all year to pay for this. It's going to take 4 years to collect the revenue at a minimum. This is going to be a long-standing threat for the investment community.
Yeah, Henrietta, talk to me about your thinking on that creation of the External Revenue Service. Do you think that that is sort of a branding tool to help this administration communicate revenue that could be used to tackle the debt ceiling, or is it something else?
I'm going to have to steal that language, Madison. That's exactly correct. Yes. We obviously already have a tariff revenue collection agency, Customs and Border Patrol. So this is a new line item, effectively, that would be really easy to read if, you know, implemented as the president has sort of laid it out. You have the IRS that collects domestic revenue. You have the External Revenue Service that collects tariff revenue. And then instead of getting an overview from, you know, CBO later on in the year, or Treasury, about where we stand on all those agencies and the revenue they're collecting, you have a very specific line item that says External Revenue Service collections. Again, this all goes back to the fact that extending the tax cuts that he passed in his first term will cost over $5 trillion. That's not even including the limitation on the cap for salt that's going to have to be adjusted, or the proposal to provide tax-free taxes on tips, or Social Security and Medicare payments being tax-free. Those are massively expensive items. And the Republican conference in the House barely has a vote to spare on these super contentious items. So the issue of reducing the deficit, or the appearance of what the deficit is going to be when they pass an extension of the tax bill, is paramount. It is the story of 2025. It really is the story of tariffs, taxes, your SALT deduction, the IRA tax credit. The whole story revolves around deficits. And you can have the External Revenue Service with a specific line item that says, hey, we're on track to generate $1 trillion. The Republican members of Congress can point to that later on and say, look, we found the money. And it'll be really easy to read.
Henry, what are you, obviously on this largest fiscal debate we're having, Trump is going to meet with lawmakers this afternoon on this, and this 1 versus 2 bill question that you referenced is still up in the air. What's the latest you're hearing on that? How likely are we going to get taxes sooner, or is this going to be an end of the year as a lot of people are expecting?
It's my ongoing view that the tax bill will not pass until it has to, which is December 30th, 2025. We don't pass big legislation on taxes typically until like the 2nd or 3rd week of December. You can go back all the way to 2010 when we were dealing with the Bush tax cuts. If I'm not mistaken, that bill passed December 17th. The last couple passed December 22nd. This is a late in the year issue. My odds are pretty aggressive on this front, but that's how I like to roll. We're at 80% that we are going to have 2 reconciliation bills. The first one, incidentally, has a completion date of around April, which is right when Trump is tasking his Commerce and USTR secretaries with identifying the state of play on Phase 1 and Section 232 and all those tariff remedies. That would be the Senate's preferred path, the House Freedom Caucus's preferred path, and the House Republican Study Committee's preferred path. And that creates a bill and a deliverable for Trump on border spending, military preparedness, and energy permitting and leasing in the first 4 months of his term. That's the fastest you can hope to pass any legislation. We'd see the budget on that probably in February. Then a second bill would be written late in the year with the fiscal year 2026 Budget Resolution Authority authorizing reconciliation. We'll see if they can pass the bill with just partisan support. Part of that will depend on the revenue coming in from tariffs and the debt ceiling. And they'll do that in the back half of the year, starting around April, May, and lasting probably through December for that debate.
And I know that you said that tariffs are going to really be the defining moment of this administration. Is there anything that we're not paying attention to that we should, perhaps things that aren't being discussed that are really also of the most importance for investors?
That's a great question. It's very fair. Honestly, I have to keep coming back to trade and tariffs. And the reason is Congress is only going to be able to pass legislation this year. After 2025, we're going to be neck deep in the 2026 midterm elections. There's going to be aggressive primary races and then a general election cycle that's going to imperil a number of Republican senators. I would say Susan Collins of Maine, who may announce her retirement instead of seek re-election. Tom Tillis in North Carolina, a state that, as you referenced before, so much of the money from the IRA goes to these red states where there is a growth in clean energy, have a real problem repealing those IRA tax credits. So the reason that investors should focus on tariffs and trade is because it's entirely implementable with just the executive branch. We do not need Congress to weigh in on tariffs or trade. So just like in Trump's first term, where we spent the first year legislating with the health bill and the tax bill, that's going to happen this time around.
Really important context, as always, from you, Henrietta. Thank you so much for making time with us to break down the initial thoughts on the Trump administration under Trump 2.0. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That's going to be all for this episode of Capital Gains. Thank you again to our guest, Henrietta, and also our co-hosts, Rochelle and Ben, for being here. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Make sure to like and subscribe to Capital Gains wherever you get your podcast, and we'll see you next time on Yahoo Finance.